There is never just one zombie. They shuffle along in mobs of desiccated corpses, motivated by an endless hunger. Like ants and mice, the one you see represents the 100 you don't see. Even in televisual iterations, zombies show up in droves. From the White Walkers in the Game of Thrones, to the cordyceps infection in The Last of Us, to the seemingly endless iterations of The Walking Dead, itself a kind of zombified TV franchise. Why are zombies such a powerful, lasting force of horror in the modern age? Scholars Jean Vervaeke, Christopher Mastropietro, and Philip Miscavige note, the zombie has represented many varieties of apocalypse without altering its basic nature. Consumerism, poverty, hunger, political dystopia, and environmental degradation. Zombies have assumed a heterogeneity of ugliness. They identify what they call a symptomology of crisis to which zombies are used as cultural response. In other words, zombies, and therefore zombie films, arise from the dead, am I right? During cultural moments of crisis to separate us from the problems we create. It is easier to shift blame onto these brainless, rotting corpses than to confront the systemic issues: corporate greed, political corruption, environmental apathy, indifference to global genocide and starvation, for which we and our governments are ultimately responsible. After all, we can just shoot them in the head and call ourselves the hero.
In this episode, we analyze two movies: George Romero's classic 1968 film, The Night of the Living Dead, and Edgar Wright's 2004 horror comedy, Shaun of the Dead. Though the films differ significantly in tone and style, we discuss the common themes of capitalism, race, and technology to highlight the promise that the zombie narrative offers. Are we merely mindless and infinitely hungry consumers? Can we transgress our historical fears of the racial, political, or sexualized other? Do we need a zombie apocalypse to change the world, or can we find a better way forward? Join us as we gather in an auditory farmhouse to ward off the creeping and mindless crowd of undead. Reanimate for the horror, live for the joy. This is Horror Joy, a podcast celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Jeff Stoynoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona. On today's episode, we are looking at 1968's Night of the Living Dead and 2004's Shaun of the Dead, continuing a little bit of zombie talk from our interview with Kelly J. Baker last week, looking at how we see different themes playing out in these zombie movies, or, don't say the Z word, Living Dead movies. So, we're going to look at a few different topics, starting with capitalism. Brian, I'll toss to you. Capitalism in Night of the Living Dead, Shaun of the Dead.
I think first, there's this kind of broad history of zombie movies that I think we have to at least acknowledge because we're leaving a lot out. Romero's movie is iconic, obviously. Shaun of the Dead, funny, kind of horror, comedy.
Do you want anything from the shop?
Part of the Cornetto trilogy by Edgar Wright. Funny movie, but there's so much that we're missing. There's so many zombie movies. You can just name zombie movies, films, video games, all of it that I think, are just not going to be able to touch on. But why talk about zombies here at Horror Joy? I think there are so many ideas that we can kind of get to. And like you're saying, capitalism is maybe high on the list. There's this quote by Deleuze and Guattari from Anti-Oedipus. The only modern myth is the myth of zombies, mortified schizos, good for work, brought back to reason. And I think what they're highlighting there is this sense in which we have an image of people working in a capitalist society, whether it's in the factory or maybe more recently at an office, in a cubicle, or whatever setting it might be, that we are just kind of going through the motions. We're there to produce endlessly, as much as we possibly can, mindlessly. It doesn't matter. We don't have feelings. We don't have any kind of human stake in the activity of working. If we want to give a very broad definition of capitalism, we could say that when we produce excess capital or excess money, where does that go? It goes to the owners of the means of production. So we, as the, capitalist working mob, are this kind of mindless machine. And I think we see this much more in Shaun of the Dead than we do in Night of the Living Dead. We get this opening scene where Shaun is kind of stumbling through the streets. People are on their phones. People are just kind of shuffling around in a daze. And this is mixed with the kind of scene in which he wakes up on the day the zombies show up. And there's a mirrored scene. And he can't even tell, right? He can't tell what is the difference between the day that was quote unquote normal and the day that the zombies kind of showed up. I think Shaun of the Dead shows us this image of this maybe capitalist society in which we're just kind of working through the drudgeries of the everyday, shuffling without any thought, to kind of mindless working mob. I guess that's where we can start. What do you think?
As you're talking there, Brian, yeah, I would agree that we don't see it as much in Night of the Living Dead. Really, we don't see it at all because it's kind of in a remote rural area where we have Night of the Living Dead going on. We might not see capitalism, but we truly see capitalism's sort of enabler or partner in world history, the war industrial complex. That's exactly what we have driving Night of the Living Dead when we have Barbara and Johnny, at the gravesite of their grandparents. Not entirely clear. They're in a cemetery discussing their grandparents, and Johnny's teasing Barbara, and they're in this like 1960s chic clothing. Even though it's in black and white, you can tell there's probably some really nice pastels involved in those dress choices. The car is a pretty nice sedan. Johnny's teasing Barbara. There's a man who's there, and Johnny seems to think the man's going to come and get Barbara. So we have that sort of strange threat sexualized there right away. Then it is a zombie, although we don't call them zombies in either of these movies, in fact.
Z word, don't say it.
Don't say the Z word. Instead, we have like a sort of living dead, like literally what Romero calls the title of the film. Shambling over, first goes after Barbara, and then Johnny and this creature get into a fight. And then Barbara's off on her adventures to go to a farmhouse where we then get to meet Ben, our African-American guy who is in this. And we'll come back to talking about this because, Brian, you and I were talking before recording about maybe what Romero's doing here with having Ben in this role. But it's not capital, it's farmland. It's very agricultural. It seems like it could be almost a place one might rusticate if they were trying to get out of the city. But as the movie goes on, as we have the encounter with the zombies become more clear, as we sort of learn more through the media coverage that is made available to them, and we'll come back to that topic too, we then get to these militias at the end of the movie. And it is this sort of glorification and celebration of men with guns.
Chief, do you think we'll be able to defeat these things?
Who are going to go shoot all of the zombies.
Well, we killed 19 of them today right in this area.
And we have a really similar scene at the end of Shaun of the Dead as well, where the, I assume, British military comes in outside of the Winchester and just starts mowing down zombies with assault rifles. So yeah, no capitalism in Shaun of the Dead, really, but plenty of war industrial complex.
I think that's right. I think so. One thing that we see early on in Night of the Living Dead is the opening credits on the way to the cemetery. There's a clear shot of the American flag, and so you can kind of question whether or not there's some kind of thing going on in terms of patriotism. I think they're visiting their father towards the end of the film. Barbara says something about, we're visiting our father. There's this clear sense in which they don't have respect for the dead. Johnny keeps telling Barbara, church is on Sunday, right?
Hey, I mean, praying's for church, huh?
That's where we pray. Stop.
Come on.
We come here once a year and they keep taking that thing we leave, but there just seems to be no respect for the dead. And so in terms of that kind of military-industrial complex, we're on the tails of the Vietnam War, which ends right 1975. And so here we are. Who are we not respecting? Maybe we're not respecting those folks that either came back and who are the walking dead, or those who died in the war. And so I think you're right to kind of point out that maybe not capitalism in Night of the Living Dead, but certainly some kind of sense of the military-industrial complex going on. There could be also, right, this is filmed in Pittsburgh, so we're probably not getting like a clear connection to any kind of maybe cotton fields. But the farmland of the rural setting, I think, doesn't separate us from capitalism. In fact, I think the farm, even now, agriculture remains an important, fundamental, necessary component of this kind of capitalist understanding of the world. What about Shaun of the Dead? Did you see capitalism in terms of Shaun of the Dead?
I think you're right to point out the way that Shaun goes about the first morning we see him. I mean, there's like the fun shots in the movie, right? And he's in this sort of zombie-esque pose, which is to imply that anyone who works in a capital industrial system like this is, in essence, a zombie of sorts, to get back to the Deleuze and Guattari quote, perhaps. He's clearly unsatisfied with his life. He's clearly doing the same thing day after day. That the movie explores this. There are those moments. He's 29 in the movie, and when I see Simon Pegg at 29, and I'm thinking, man, that's a rough 29. No offense to Simon Pegg, and he has like these coworkers he's working with, and like a local British equivalent of a Radio Shack is what it seems to be. But yeah, like he's going about his day. Everything is just a cog and wheel sort of system. There doesn't seem to be a lot of joy in what it is he's doing. His friend is playing video games on the couch all the time. He's not contributing. There's some like the third roommate in their flat seems to have a more professional job. There's some tension there. So there's class dynamics that are playing out. If it's not capitalism necessarily, there are definite class dynamics that are playing out in all of this film. And maybe we'll come back to how we see class playing in Night of the Living Dead too. But in Shaun of the Dead, the class dynamics it's very reminiscent of some of these studies of British culture post 1980s. But once we see like the British economy sort of slow down a bit, once we see the disinvestment out of social programs in the UK, how a lot of folks who are working class are left in this zombified state. They don't have the social safety net they once did. They are struggling. They seem to have like this just malaise about them. And the entire friend group in Shaun of the Dead very much fits that with the sort of different characters and how they all seem to be unfulfilled in their own way. That's set in sharp relief later on when we get to Shaun's mom's house with his stepdad, played just brilliantly by Bill Nighy. They have a Jaguar.
I guess we'll have to take the Jag.
And they have this sort of posh house, and everyone seems to be really jealous of that. Like this is a generational class wealth gap that we might see playing out before our very eyes here in the United States currently too. And all of that seems to speak to that the world's ending. And it's not really clear for this friend group what they have to lose with the world ending in this sort of apocalypse. And at the end of the movie, and maybe this is part of the comedy, it seems that really nothing has changed. They've just found the way to make these zombies work in the service industry. It's almost like these zombies are a predecessor to AI if AI were going to be used productively to let humans do things that are enjoyable, like, art and music. But no, we'll let the AI do the art and the music. Sorry, I'll get off that soapbox. But maybe to compare that, if I could, to Night of the Living Dead, how we see class conflict going on there, we don't get a clear picture of class once everyone's in the farmhouse. Everyone's just sort of surviving at that point. But I think it's really important what you mentioned, where Johnny and Barbara are coming in from out of town. So they are outsiders in their way coming into this maybe more rural setting. They clearly come from some means, whereas we don't really get a picture of what the means are of the folks in the sort of survival house, if you will. There's a bit of privilege that Barbara and Johnny seem to have. I mean, Barbara is in shock and traumatized for most of the movie, and I don't want to underplay that. However, she is also a caricature of the useless 1960s housewife in all of the worst ways. She is incapable of doing anything for herself throughout the entirety of the film. She's kind of a burden for other people to bear. And I don't know if that is an intentional thing or if that is just a sort of way of reading that. Again, like I said, I think a generous way to read this character is she's in shock and she's going through trauma. But I do think there are definitely people who will watch this film and who have watched this film who would read her as sort of a dead weight that is just indicative of who she is as a woman during this time period. And I think that's problematic, whether or not it's intended. But again, it does speak to the class privilege and the class dynamics going on. Brian, maybe I'll turn to you here for some of these thoughts.
I think what you're saying is really interesting here, right? I think that like you're saying, there's a class privilege, maybe living in the suburbs outside of the city or whatever, and then having to travel into the danger. Can we read that as something like traveling to the dangers of the city? I agree with you that there's this clear sense in which she's in shock and traumatized. And I wonder if there's also a sense in which we can read a continual trauma where not only does she find herself in a farmhouse with a dead body, she goes up the stairs, she finds a dead body, and that's shocking to her. Not only did she see her brother die, but then who's the first person that shows up? A black man we know as Ben. Is this a perpetuation of that trauma? Does she find herself in a situation in which she feels unsafe? It made me think of George Yancey's example of being in an elevator. George Yancey writes this amazing book called Black Bodies, White Gazes about anti-racism, whiteness, all that kind of stuff. It's just an incredible book. But I think what I find in Barbara and Ben is the sense in which they're locked in a house, right? They have to board up the windows. And Ben he wants to do business. He wants to board up the windows, make sure that they're safe. It's really unclear what Barbara is thinking or feeling, but you can definitely see that she's pulling away. She doesn't want to participate in that activity. And in Yancey's example, right, he's in an elevator as a black man with a white woman, and maybe without thinking about it, the white woman is clutching her purse or seeming to act in a way that she feels like she's in danger. So when we're here in 1968 and, all of the kind of things that are happening in the United States at the time, is it the case that we can read this, right, from that cultural perspective as a worry about race? Is she feeling threatened by being alone in a boarded up house with a black man? That's unclear, and it's interesting that also Ben's race doesn't get talked about in the movie at all. But we also see Barbara as this kind of maybe mute, like you're saying. Maybe she is this kind of useless woman who doesn't have any skills or something like that. I'm not really sure where to go with that, but I think it might be a good chance to then transition into a discussion about race in Night of the Living Dead and Shaun of the Dead, but zombies generally. Wanted to know if you have thoughts about either what I said or if you wanted to take us into the conversation about race. Certainly have lots to say about it. So what do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I think it's curious that in Night of the Living Dead, none of the living dead creatures, beings, the Wakas, are black. They're all white. Ben is the only black African-American, we assume, person in this entire film. So why? Why does Romero choose to have one black character who is essentially our hero in this film? What's he doing here? What's he commenting about? This is one of those moments, maybe we need a spoiler alert or like a trigger warning for these things, that folks are going to get annoyed because the professors are going to just, instead of just watching the movie, we're going to ask questions. So here we are. Why is there one black man in this film? I mean, we're pretty much right on the heels of the civil rights movement at this point. We're not in the South, though. We're in Pittsburgh. As you mentioned earlier, we've gone to this sort of farm setting. So having a black man on a farm setting, there's a long history there. It's curious. The way in which he's doing all of the work and Barbara's not doing any of the work. You do mention that no one remarks upon it during the movie. I don't think he's referred to as the black guy ever. He's just referred to as Ben, even by Helen, who is Harry, Helen, and then Karen Cooper are the family that shows up later on. Harry obviously doesn't like Ben, but can we assume that's a race issue, or is it he wants to be in charge and he doesn't like not being in charge? Are they just having like this sort of machismo masculinity face off? It could be either, but I mean, I don't know. I think as a viewer of a movie shot in 1968, given the sort of time period, given racial tensions around the country, given, Brian, before the show, you were talking about the Detroit riots of 67. So given that we're right on the heels of that and the ways in which the media portrayed those riots as the African-American people rioting as sort of being almost like a shambling mass of living dead. Is this reflecting that? Is this engaging that in some way? Probably. I mean, Romero is not one of these types where even if you were to interview him, I don't think he's going to say that, oh no, I wasn't thinking about anything going on socially or politically. Like, that's not the way this man made film. So I think it's probably commenting on all of those things. So race is definitely set in sharp relief in Night of the Living Dead. What did we do with it? Maybe some ideas there, Brian, you can touch on here in a minute. Shaun of the Dead, I mean, it's 2004, so not quite in 2024 where we are trying to have more diversity in our casting with our main characters. Because the main characters of Shaun of the Dead are very white. We do have some other characters of color. So we have like the sort of stereotypical owner and operator of the corner store. Hard to say for sure how this man reads, but he's definitely not just a white British person. Even in the Winchester, like all of the characters who they interact with are white. Shaun's parents, stepdad, and his mom, Barbara, are both white. The folks they interact with, the folks they work with. So there aren't any black characters or characters of color in Shaun of the Dead, either in significant roles. So, but again, this is 2004, where like if you're going to have sort of just casting calls for people to play zombies, you're more likely to have probably people of color who are going to be in these roles. But when you're like casting your main characters, we're still not sort of in that era of equity and inclusion to have like a more diverse representative cast, which is remarkable. I mean, just this isn't really a topic we're going to get into today, but it is remarkable to think about how far we've come in 2024. While also acknowledging how far we still have to go. So, Brian, I don't know, thoughts there of my brains, zombies, my word salads there on race in Night of the Living Dead and Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah, we got to be careful about our brains. Hide them if you can. But I think something that's interesting, like you're saying about Shaun of the Dead, it seems very white. That's very homogenous. And maybe we can talk about privilege in some way in those terms too. Because when we see Ed, that's Nick Frost's character. What does he do? Does he work? It's unclear. He's able to afford a flat with 2 other people. We're in London, allegedly. They talk about money that he's brought in, and it's from selling a little bit of weed, right?
It's not the end of the world.
And he's in no danger of being homeless. He's in no danger of being incarcerated for his involvement with selling of drugs. Whether or not you can just say, oh, that's because he's white, there's something that we can extrapolate from the film, given that it's, right, 2004 London, the cast is all white. Maybe we have some interaction with a non-white person in the store, but few and far between. I think that's interesting to think about. The Night of the Living Dead is really interesting. Like you said, we've got these 1967 Detroit riots. What I think is important to remember is that Romero is filming this at the same time that the riots are happening. There are reports that only half or something like that, half the movie was scripted by the time that they were shooting it. And they were in some way responding to what's happening in Detroit during these riots. Not only do we get the sense in which, right, all the zombies are white, but there's also a point in the film where the broadcast, either, I can't remember if it's on the radio or on the television, describes them as normal-looking people.
We have some descriptions of the assassins.
So they're trying to tell you who to look out for.
Eyewitnesses say they are ordinary-looking people.
They're just normal-looking people. And that could, right, also be coded as white folks. Because, again, when we look at somebody like George Yancey's work, who's doing philosophy of race, he's going to demarcate this kind of transcendental norm. And what that looks like is whiteness. And get the sense of what is not white is different. And so that's already potentially a marker of danger. Again, Yancey talks about the black body as being read as threatening. Here, Night of the Living Dead, they're described as ordinary looking people. So again, that feels coded as white. I think we also have to remember the history of zombies. So I talked about this a little bit in our episode with Kelly J. Baker. There's a book by W. Scott Poole that I think is really interesting about the birth of modern horror in the war, in World War I specifically. But he describes like 2 different origins for zombies. One of them is from World War I. We get people coming back. They're the Walking Dead. They are in shock. They don't seem like they used to be. Or there's all the people that were left on the battlefield who died. And there's a fear that, like Johnny, we're not respecting the dead. The second one is these ideas about voodoo and voodoo in Haiti, where there were fears of rituals that would bring people back from the dead for the sake of perpetual service. And that's clearly a reference to slavery. So the image of the zombie comes out of war, and it comes out of slavery, specifically the enslavement of Black communities. And so we get that in Night of the Living Dead very clearly. What do we have? We have a response in some way to Vietnam. That ends 2 years before they start filming. That's, I think, still clearly on their mind. Who's coming back? Who are we respecting? The sense of the kind of racialized other that is going on in Detroit at the same time. Again, Maybe Shaun of the Dead is just kind of a product of its time, 2004. We just don't have a critical lens. And like you're saying, I think at least what we've got now is the ability to look at that kind of film and say, what's going on here? Why can we think about this group of white people interacting with only white people in London? Isn't that a little bit strange? And maybe this is a critique or a heightening of the anxiety of capitalism and the shambling right mobs that we talked about. Is this a specific class that we're talking about? And who's in that class? Well, maybe it's white folks. And again, we can talk about privilege in that sense too. I think those are my thoughts on race. There's certainly lots more to say. I think we could kind of think about this for a long time, but I wanted to see if you wanted to follow up with any of the race conversation, or if we wanted to move on to the sense of media or kind of how that worked in both films. I think both films use television specifically in a very interesting way. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I was struck by your discussion of voodoo or voodoo and how we have that maybe as a source for zombies, but also then World War One as maybe a source of the zombie figure. When you were talking about the World War One bit, when people are coming back with what they would have called shell shock, then I was just thinking to the character of Septimus Smith in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, who we sort of read from his perspective, and he's this very broken individual. So I've never thought of Septimus as a zombie, but it's curious. Or even Shadrach from Toni Morrison's Sula. Both characters who are returning from war with trauma in their way. But what I was thinking of more is with voodoo or voodoo, how we see zombies then appropriated into, I want to say like almost video games or like role-playing game culture with necromancy, which probably goes beyond that into other mythology and folklore. How often we see there's always a nefarious individual who's raising the dead to do their bidding. That this might be an interesting way to consider Deleuze and Guattari's quote about capitalism, and how if business is using people in the way that a necromancer raises the dead to do their bidding, that business and capitalism use human bodies in the same way, even though we think we have agency, we probably don't in these systems in a certain way. A limited agency, perhaps we could say. You and I initially, when we had begun planning this episode, attempted to play some video games, and maybe just take a brief turn down this side road with Resident Evil. And I'll let you speak to your experience, but I lied and I failed and I wasn't able to get Resident Evil 1, but on the Xbox Game Pass, Resident Evil 2 was available. And I'm bad at first-person shooters to start with. I'll put that out there. So they could have sent me to the Olympics and I would have done just as well as the US team did for shooting, which is to say last place. The irony. But these first-person shooters, even going the whole way back to like GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64, I was just fodder. I was just in the match to end up being someone else's kill. The zombies ate me, man. Like they just immediately ate me. I could not navigate my controls fast enough or aim well enough to get the headshot, to kill the zombie, to not die. And then there's limited ammunition. I'm sorry, what? What do you mean I only have so many bullets to fire at this like shambling mass? So even though like we're not going to really talk about that because neither one of us had a particularly fruitful experience while playing these video games with zombies, to maybe try to experience that source of joy that some people get, just riddling zombified bodies with bullets. We do see Ed doing this in Shaun of the Dead, where we see video games. I don't know that it's a zombie video game as much as it's like a Call of Duty type game. This becomes something they're doing in video games, and then we see it in real life at the end of the film when they're all holed up in the Winchester, where, you know, we get to prove that the rifle is real. I told you, like that whole thing going on throughout the movie. And then they find the bullets and they start shooting, and it turns out both of them are pretty terrible at shooting the real gun in real life at actual zombies. So this isn't speaking directly to our next topic, but it just interested me how we weren't going to talk about video games, but Shaun of the Dead has video games. And then the voodoo conversation, I do think is interesting how we see, if we look at zombies or the living dead, the raised dead, if you will, as doing the work of somebody else, we can ask, what is that work? And maybe why is that work, in productive ways to consider in the different settings we see these creatures employed. And what's curious in both of these scenarios, well, no, Shaun of the Dead, they are actually eating the bodies. That's true. People get ripped apart in pretty horrific ways at some different points. with like spaghetti Twizzler insides. But in Night of the Living Dead don't eat the people they kill. They're not trying to bite them and eat them. Even though when Barbara finds the corpse in the house, it's pretty mangled. But when we get other examples, people aren't really eating them, are they?
I thought that, so there's a moment when they go out to get gas for the car and things go very poorly, right?
Right.
The car basically catches on fire. And I thought at that point they were pulling the two people that were in the truck out and eating them.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but even then, are they not eating raw flesh? This is cooked flesh. So I don't know, right? Here we are back to the idea that Romero zombies are using tools. Not only do they pick up rocks to break headlights on the car, but now they're barbecuing people. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, my only point there was like, speaking back to last episode with Kelly J. Baker, these undead in Night of the Living Dead are not just husks. They seem to have some sentience, which makes them, to my mind, slightly more scary. And a little behind the scenes, before we pivoted to Shaun of the Dead, we had thought about doing 28 Days Later. Unfortunately, given copyright issues, it's impossible to find 28 Days Later to stream anywhere in the United States right now. So we had to pivot to Shaun of the Dead, which is perfectly fine. Maybe some other episode we'll get back to 28 Days Later, but I do think the zombies you see in 28 Days Later and that entire franchise are more in line with the Romero Living Dead in the way that they aren't sentient per se, or they don't use tools in quite the same way, but they are definitely a little more active than your run-of-the-mill Living Dead. Sorry to take us off on a little side road there, Brian, but maybe we'll get back on track here and sort of pivot to looking at news media and how we see news media functioning in both these films, yeah?
Couple of things. Before we get there, I want to say the idea of the zombies as flesh-eating, right? There's this sense in which they're mindless consumers. So here we get the other side of capitalism. Not only are they working for somebody else, but they're consuming also. And it seems like their appetite is endless. So there's never a time when a zombie goes, oh, I'm full, I'm cool now. There's this sense in which the desire and the appetite for flesh is infinite. I think that's important. And yeah, we do get the zombie eating flesh for sure in Shaun of the Dead. I do think we get it in Night of the Living Dead. I think at the end, again, this comes from one of the broadcasts.
Butler County Sheriff has verified that reports of murder victims
That they say that they've confirmed that they're eating the flesh of people.
being partially eaten by their slayers is true.
They call them flesh-eating ghouls at one point. And so I do think that this is part of Romero's understanding. I want to talk about video games very briefly because my experience was also very brief. I tried to play Evil Dead, and goodness gracious, am I bad at this? I just kept dying. And I couldn't get past really any significant part. Here's the important part for me. When you're thrust into that game, there's a sense in which you're surviving. Why am I going to shoot these zombies? Well, because if I don't, I'm not going to survive. That happens in Night of the Living Dead. It happens in Shaun of the Dead. It happens in almost every zombie movie. So I think there's a sense in which, for me, not being a skilled and habituated video game player, when I'm thrust into the video game and I'm shooting the zombie, it's for survival only. And I think that goes back to Kelly's point. Kelly's book talks a lot about how people make zombie dummies for shooting practice, often out of the image of people that they feel most threatened by. So there's a sense in which the zombie image is a mirror on our anxieties about who or what kinds of communities we feel most threatened by, and I think that's important. That sense of survival is, I think, thrust up against whoever we feel threatened by. Is it the homogenous, othered immigrant? A concern about people coming in and threatening our jobs? Is it a concern about, again, Barbara being threatened by Ben, potentially, but the threat of some racialized other? Is that the concern? Is it the threat of some political other? Right? Whatever it is, I think there's that sense of survival. Okay. I do want to move on to this idea of communication and news and how that works out in both films. So a couple of things I'll lay out here and I want to get your thoughts. Both films use television specifically as a means of communicating what's happening. So in Night of the Living Dead, this moves from the radio at the beginning. First, we hear stuff on the radio, and then later on, we see things happening on the television. And I want to call back to the riots that are happening in 1967 Detroit. It seems as though Romero was pulling specifically from that kind of imagery. How do we see the people protesting? We see them as mobs. We see them as these kind of mindless, destructive people. So Romero says, look, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make all the zombies white. Won't that be transgressive in some way? But two, there's a sense in which the zombies do have feelings in Night of the Living Dead. At one point, Ben says, we now know that they're afraid of fire.
They're afraid of fire. I found that out.
And it struck me that the sense of fear that a zombie can have is an emotional, at least, assignment to these, they call them things. And so the point here is, should we root for the zombies? Are they trying to break down whatever thing that we're seeing happening? Shaun of the Dead, we see the drudgery of the everyday. We're going to the Winchester every night. Is a zombie trying to break down this rut in which we're in, the modern life setting of Shaun of the Dead? Shaun of the Dead uses the television in an interesting way too. I think maybe as a callback to Night of the Living Dead.
Where no one official is prepared to comment, religious groups are calling it Judgment Day.
There are lots of ways in which we see the television flipping channels.
As an increasing number of reports of
Serious attacks on
people who are literally being eaten alive.
And it's telling the story from the kind of nature documentary channel to the soccer pitch. It's highlighting and narrating the actual events. But I think what's interesting about Shaun of the Dead is that you get this flipping of channels. And so in Shaun of the Dead, you have, 100 channels? In Night of the Living Dead, you have one channel. And so there's something interesting about the way that maybe we understand our access to the world differently. And we see that in the difference between Shaun of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead. Want to get your thoughts? What do you think about the use of media, communication technologies, or the use of tools in these zombie movies?
I keep thinking back to the zombie or the undead guy using the rock in the beginning of Night of the Living Dead. When we were rewatching these films, I just sort of yelled out, like, zombies don't do that, as if like, there are rules about what zombies do and don't do. But that struck me. With the media and communication, I'm still really, I need to go back and rewatch it for, I don't know, the 10th, 11th, 12th time. But with Night of the Living Dead, I'm still curious why we have only the radio to start with. There's not even a discussion of a television until we have other people arrive at the house. Then suddenly, oh, there's a television and we are all going to sit around the television. So part of me wonders if there's a commentary there about how we sit around a television and look to the television for news and look to the television to tell us what to do. Is this like a Ray Bradbury Fahrenheit 451 type message? Is it something to do with the family that's arrived where the danger is coming from inside the house? No. It just was curious to me. And maybe this speaks to the idea that Romero didn't have the entire script planned out when this started. Maybe there wasn't anything to broadcast on the television at this point in time because they didn't have any sort of resistance to show film clips of. It struck me in the news footage we get with the militia and such towards the end that they look more like mobsters than they do actual military folks. Like it reminds you of something you might see out of The Godfather or a Godfather adjacent type movie. And I do wonder what that says about what happens in a post-law, post-society, post-apocalyptic world. Maybe we can sort of think back to the Fallout series as we discussed with Kelly J. Baker in the last episode. With Shaun of the Dead, it's just very much an early 2000s mediascape of cable television. This is before streaming. This is just whatever is on cable. And there's the joke at the Winchester at the end when all of the channels are offline, that there's hundreds of channels, but nothing's ever on. Liz makes that joke sort of tongue in cheek to try to lighten the mood because they're looking for news and there's nothing. They're just sort of on their own. And there is that very clear moment where they don't know what else to do. They turn to the television to be told what they already know, which is to say, you're on your own. Good luck with this. Help is not on the way, even though in the end it ends up being on the way thanks to the mirrored friend group with Yvonne and others.
Yvonne.
That Shaun seems to like know from school or something. She's carrying around that golf club wearing sort of military fatigues, a badass. One other communication thing I will point out with both films, though. So Night of the Living Dead, there's the phone. and Barbara's inability to understand the phone is dead. She keeps like, the very old movie thing where you're hitting the receiver to try to make sure that's not just like your connection, you're making sure the line's actually dead. And we see one of the zombies just sort of is ambling around, pulls down the phone cord on the outside of the house. It has to be the phone cord because it goes right from that scene. Then it cuts to Barbara trying to use the telephone inside and the line is dead. In Shaun of the Dead, there are cell phones. They're not smartphones quite yet. There are those little old Nokias and Motorola's that all of us who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s remember oh so well. You could, for the record, kids, throw one of those things across the room and it would still work. Ed's phone goes off at the most inopportune times throughout this film, particularly at the end when they are trying to get into the Winchester and they're surrounded by the Z words. His little like Motorola phone goes off, or Kyocera, whatever it is. And he's like talking to his friend, his mate, who might be his drug dealer, the guy he sells drugs for. This is all very confusing and curious. None of us really know. But there is that form of communication, but that they interestingly don't turn to use in this movie. I mean, Shaun's using a landline when he's calling his mom, Barbara, and when he's calling Liz, and when he's trying to make reservations. In fact, I don't even know if Shaun has a cell phone. The only person who seems to have a cell phone in this movie is Ed. But at no point does Ed think to try to use his cell phone to call anyone for help or to figure out how to use it effectively as a communication device. It essentially is just like a weird comic plot device to ring at inopportune times and to somehow reflect more on Ed's character as being this kind of just parasite of a human who, though he's Shaun's friend, doesn't seem to really contribute to anything except for like his, turn at the end of the film, spoiler alert, where he'll wait in the basement to hold off the zombies coming from the hatch to then let Liz and Shaun escape. So with television, Brian, I think you're right. I think we're just seeing like a reflection of 21st century media with Shaun of the Dead, with Night of the Living Dead. I just do think it's curious, like that we have just the radio signal, but then we get the television broadcast as well. We don't have a clear sense of place in either. That's maybe something that I think media does remove us from a sense of place in a lot of ways when it's just become so ubiquitous. Although like we do get the one moment in the newscast in Night of the Living Dead where they name 3 cities, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Miami. And I don't understand why Miami gets lumped in with Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Those two, I understand the proximity, but Miami is very far south. I need to look that up at some point. This is one of those rabbit holes I'm going to fall down. Anything there, Brian, with media that you want to sort of go back to? Or
the one thing I want to say is I really like your point about the cell phones in Shaun of the Dead. And I think that feels very early 2000s, where cell phones in many ways feel like a nuisance. We're not used to carrying them around as much as we are now. And so when do they go off? Yeah, they go off in the worst times, at the movie theater, at school, in church, whatever, right? Cell phones are just a nuisance. And there's a moment when they're trying to get into the Winchester, Ed's cell phone goes off, and what does he do? He answers it, right? And so I think, again, that feels like that very 2000, I don't know, making fun of how people are using phones. They're answering them inappropriately. They're getting calls inappropriately. It's just interrupting everything that we're doing. So I think there's something there. That's interesting. All right, Jeff, if you're willing, I'd like to just kind of revisit the question of race very, very briefly, if we can. And that's at the end of both films. Very famously, at the end of The Night of the Living Dead, we see Ben shot. The military, or maybe the mob, maybe it's some kind of militia coming through.
Paramilitary.
Yeah, saving the day. I don't know. They're trying to clear out the zombies. They see Ben. He's holding a gun, and they shoot him. It's hard not to read 2024 into that image where the black man is holding a gun and the militia, military, law enforcement, whoever it is, shoots Ben.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head.
Is it because he's black? Is it because he's supposed to be a zombie?
Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him.
We didn't see any other zombies holding guns, but we know that they were using tools. It's unclear. At the end of Shaun of the Dead, we get a very, very similar scene in which the military shows up. The survivors put their hands up, and the military somehow knows, right? They're shooting all the other zombies. The military somehow knows not to shoot these ones. Again, Shaun of the Dead, the main characters here are white. Is that part of the conversation here? Is it not? It just struck me, rewatching both these films back to back, that final scene seems so similar, and yet there's a very different outcome. Didn't know if you had thoughts about that.
It does make one wonder particularly with the ending in Night of the Living Dead. As you mentioned, we've talked, Ben is the only Black character in the entire film. He is shot famously at the end of the movie just because he's holding a gun and he seems like a threat. Is he a threat because he's holding a gun? Is he a threat because he's a Black man? Is he a threat because he's a Black man holding a gun? D, all of the above. I'm not sure. It seems too much of a coincidence for Romero to have literally one Black character in this entire film for there not to be some commentary on race to that end. If the news media, we just finished talking about media, but if the news media had been the 24-hour, relentless, ubiquitous news cycle that it is now in the 60s, we would have a much better record of all of the police brutality, of the military force used against communities of color during this time period. So I think Romero might be reminding us of that. We talked about the Detroit riots of 67, but there are all sorts of massacres, the Tulsa massacre. These things aren't included in history books. They're rarely taught in public high schools. The average American, the average white American has no idea about the history of racial violence in this country. Predominantly in this, like in just this past century. You know, this is not like ancient history. This is not Civil War era history even. This is the 20th century, after 1950, in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, in the United States of America. You have a lot of violence being exercised against Black communities. In this, now the 21st century, we have all sorts of video evidence, whether it's cell phones or police cameras or what have you, of this sort of violence being perpetrated against communities of color. Most recently, Sonia Massey, the woman who called a sheriff's department to investigate a prowler and ends up getting shot in the head by a sheriff's deputy. Is Romero commenting on that? Probably. It sort of, more than anything, is just depressing to think that that was almost 40 years ago and it's still the same story being played out over and over and over again. Whereas, as you said, in Shaun of the Dead, and granted, you know, we're in a different country in Shaun of the Dead. I think it's worth recognizing that we are in the UK for Shaun of the Dead. Is that to say that if Shaun of the Dead were set in, I don't know, New York City or Pittsburgh, just since Night of the Living Dead is set Pittsburgh adjacent anyway, would the two white characters in that movie have survived if the military just decided to open fire and indiscriminately shoot at everything? Hard to say. Is this part of the comedy of Shaun of the Dead? The fact that like these two somehow survive as you have these military, like literal military, British military, being emptied out of trucks and then just opening fire with assault weapons all around them. Like, is it a commentary on race to your question? Yeah. I think even a generous reading of Shaun of the Dead is that it's just a matter of privilege. Like where you somehow survive because you were going to survive, because that's what this movie's about. Maybe that's the rom-com part, Brian. The idea that Liz and Shaun somehow survive and love conquers all or something. Now we need like a power ballad.
That's right. They survive it all and they have each other at the end. And they've mixed up their routine, but it's also the same. I think that's not sure exactly what to do with that. I think it's hard not to read our time now into the images of Night of the Living Dead. Like you're saying, we see it. It's in our history. And it remains in our history, and that's hard. So, do we want to think about trying to find joy here?
Probably should.
Where's the joy in zombies? I'll throw it to you, see if you have any thoughts. I have some thoughts on the joy here, but want to know what you think.
Yeah, earlier, I think a bit tongue-in-cheek, you mentioned, should we be rooting for the zombies because of what they're trying to tear down? To be clear, no, I don't think we should be rooting for the zombies. But I think part of the joy of any movie with zombies is using them as, and this is what, you know, Kelly J. Baker makes this point in her book too, using them as a mirror, looking at sort of what they show us about ourselves and the society we're living in. So the joy for me in zombie movies is thinking about, okay, what problems, what issues in society are the zombies focusing us on? How can we then maybe fix those? Can we think of zombies or like the apocalypse of zombies, these post-apocalyptic sort of scenarios as a reset? Can we then, in our real lived societies, bring about positive change to affect that reset without needing a zombie apocalypse? So I think you have to work a little to get the joy in some of these cases. Like this is not like I'm watching this and having a good time because zombies, but rather it's what's the promise of zombies? I think maybe that's where I can find joy in a zombie film. Like, what is the unfulfilled promise of a zombie?
I like that. I like the warning that maybe we shouldn't root for zombies. Here's one pushback potentially. If it's the case that what we get in Romero is a kind of flipping of the script, where what we're seeing is the white community as the mob perpetuating a sense of violence, does it make us think about what is actually happening in Detroit at the time? Does it show us that, in fact, we should be understanding what's happening here? Or is it the case that when we look at the zombie narrative, there is some critique that is offering, like you said, an unfulfilled promise at the moment? One book that I have really liked is The Girl with All the Gifts. I'm not sure if you know this one. Also a movie, but The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. And I think it's interesting because there is a sense in which what we end up with, and this is a spoiler if you haven't read the book, I apologize because this is the takeaway. At the end of the book, it's left us with the world inhabited by zombies. The zombies now are sentient. In fact, they're smart and they have an ability to reshape the world. And there's something interesting there. So as we kind of think through the zombie narrative as it continues to perpetuate, is it the case that we are in fact rooting for the zombies? If the zombies are a mob, do we now no longer see them as a mindless mob, but as a mob of transgression, of one that shows us some new world? And like you're saying, maybe we don't want the zombie apocalypse. We don't want to have riots. We don't want to have protests. We don't want to have these things. However, the zombie image gives us the possibility of some kind of promise whereby we see the effectiveness of communal action. The joy here, right? Like you're saying, it's in the practice of thinking through what is our world, what is our monster, and how do we flip the script? We talked with Kelly about the fact that sometimes zombie films just seem to tell us that zombies are the worst. In fact, there's an article by Gary Canavan called We Are the Walking Dead, and he talks a lot about how Kirkman seemed to set up The Walking Dead specifically as a narrative that showcased that, in fact, it's our society that's wrong and not the zombies. The zombies are just a kind of mechanism. So, how can we change? How can we move on? What's the promise? Where do we go? I think that's worth the conversation, and I think also a potential source of joy, at least for me. Things we want to say as we wrap up?
I guess maybe just one last piece of joy from Shaun of the Dead is their friendship somehow survives even the zombie apocalypse. I think that's supposed to be comedy, but it is kind of cute at the end of the film where Shaun and Ed are still playing video games, but now out in the shed, and Ed, now fully zombified, has been chained up and is like trying to bite Shaun's arm as he reaches over for the remote control, as Queen's You're My Best Friend is playing in the background as the credits roll out. So that's cute, and there is maybe a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there with the idea that their routine was almost like zombies anyway, so what's the difference? But yeah, I mean, it's cute.
And maybe that once Shaun, moves on and becomes a good partner for Liz, that he has to get rid of his friendship, right? His intimate friendship with Ed, but Ed as a zombie works perfectly. So maybe this is a kind of critique of rom-coms generally. Shaun of the Living Dead is funny, and there's certainly joy in that. Right, we will wrap up here. So what did we do today? We talked about zombies. We acknowledge that there's so much more to say about zombies that we just didn't get to. Hopefully, we will have future episodes that continue to expand this conversation. We talked about the issue of zombies and capitalism. Is it the case that zombies give us an image of mindless workers in a capitalist system? Does it provide a critique or a myth for capital? Second, we talked about the issues of race. Very famously in Night of the Living Dead, with Ben as the main character, and how that works out maybe in class and privilege more explicitly in Shaun of the Dead. We talked about some issues of communication, how technology works in each film, and how that relates to the zombie narrative as well. Hopefully we've offered some very brief and insightful history of how zombies have worked, where they came from, and how that relates to these specific films. Lastly, we found some joy. Hopefully you did too. Thanks for listening. Jeff, any final words?
Thank you all for listening. I hope you found some joy in this too, and for all of you Romero heads out there, please don't come for us if we mistook anything.
Yes, please. All right, y'all. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.